My name is Luke Nathan Phillips. You are listening to Match My Mountains, a show about conservation and conservation in history, the history of conservation, and various other things. But the purpose of this show is to try to help a general audience, and particularly people involved in the political process at all, to not only care about, but way more importantly, to understand a lot of the dynamics that go into the public land system and American conservation as a whole. These are things that are not just the national parks and Smokey Bear. These are things that have a really complicated backdrop to it. There's a reason you have people who do hold grad programs on this stuff and big government agencies where people do this stuff for decades. And over the course of this episode, I want to help bring a little bit more of that complexity out. So for that, we are joined by somebody who has spent many, many years doing exactly that and has a lot of deep insights that I'm pleased we'll be able to share with you. His name is Wes Siler. He has been a journalist in the outdoor and conservation space for quite some time. And he's somebody who is both informative and entertaining. And if you're a writer, you know that it's a little bit harder to be able to hit that balance than many would imagine it to be. So with that, Wes, thanks for being on the show. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Luke. Thanks for having me. I think you covered it. I am a journalist. I've always been a journalist since I dropped out of school to be a journalist back in like 2002, back in London. That was a very long time ago. And I started off in, bizarrely, the fashion world. Which was weird. I just sort of, had a giant crush on like one of my professors in college, and she got me an internship. So I just like, I'll do whatever you tell me, hot professor lady.
It
But it was
normally
really
goes the other way.
yeah. It was really cool. And I went from there. That was a small magazine called Intersection, it started out as a part of Dazed and Confused, which is a big fashion magazine in London, big independent fashion magazine. From there, I did Jalopnik. It was number two. We built Jalopnik into the largest car website on earth. Hell for Leather was my motorcycle blog. That I built into like the most widely read publication that that world will ever see, because that world is really rapidly collapsing since people don't like risk anymore. Sold that to private equity, did a tech startup in that world. And then I launched Indefinitely Wild, which is relevant to this conversation. And Indefinitely Wild was sort of about adventure travel in the outdoors. And I did that in partnership with Gawker Media. So we had a bunch of readers. In like 18 months, I grew that to like 3.4 million readers. And so Outside came calling at the same time. Peter Thiel and Hulk Hogan were suing Nick Denton, the owner of Gawker, to try to destroy him, and they succeeded. And so I joined Outside and was there for a decade until the tech bro that just acquired that fired me because he's a goddamn moron. And so now I'm independent on Substack, and you can find my Substack on wessiler.substack.com.
Is your archive at Outdoor Magazine still available to the public, or is that paywall as well?
Outside Magazine, everything's still public. One of like the things about journalism is that you can't really like ethically delete old articles since they can be referenced. So like everything's there is still alive. So I have like a decade of writing an article a day for Outside that's still populating the internet and probably fueling 20% of their total traffic or something.
Well, everybody listening, if you want some good advice on different kinds of guns or where the best places to do ATVing are in Montana, there's some pretty good stuff out there. Also, Wes, I had no idea that you also had a unfortunate run-in with Peter Thiel World. One of my backgrounds is conservative journalism here around DC, and Peter Thiel has managed to fund quite a few of the newer ones for the last about half a decade. And it's
Yes.
kind of hard to avoid teal bucks for a lot of the newer things, which, opens up kind of interesting things for public lands world too, but more on
Yeah.
that at some point. There has been recently, so you've kept a particular standard on how to talk about public lands and conservation issues, which have unfortunately been becoming much, much, much more relevant since the first election of President Trump in 2016, 2017. As you know, it's an issue that is really, really emotional, and there's a lot of general public consensus that the national parks are good, the national forests are good, bison and everything is good. You see polls all the time, something between 70% and 90% of Americans surveyed will have generally positive feelings about and proactive policy intentions about the public land system, but nobody puts it as their first issue at all. You have, sorry, second.
No, I was just agreeing
Oh,
with you, and
yeah,
it honestly shouldn't be people's first issue. There's
yeah.
there's much more important issues. Public lands are fundamental for democracy. They're really, really, we need clean air, we need clean water, we need biodiversity to survive. We need democracy. We need access to actually recreation and going outdoors and being healthy. But the most important issues should be freedom and the ability to live your life as the person that you are and not be persecuted because your skin color isn't our skin color or because you're not a straight white man like I am and you might be.
I
Um,
also, despite looking like the former Secretary of Transportation a little bit, I am indeed a straight.
I don't like to assume, it's everybody can do their own thing. But
Yeah.
those issues, like, freedom is fundamentally the most important because it's inherently our project in America is to create freedom. And the fact that those things are under assault, public lands is one issue within that freedom. But we have to not lose sight of the fact that there are, fundamentally people are under attack and having their lives threatened by our government for literally just who they are. And that's fucking evil.
Well, that's entirely true, but there are also particular issues that nobody will really do well or talk about if people who care deeper about them than most of the public does. And I think I don't know. I think there's ways that you do serve the broader common good and the cause of democracy and the republic through things like public lands.
Yes, absolutely.
In Yeah, and actually, I'd like to hear your thoughts on some of the ways that is true. But before we get to there, just real quick, you and I both have recently gotten off of political campaigns for it. Everybody, Wes was running for the Montana State Legislature as a Democrat in a very red state. I was recently running for the United States Congress as a Republican in an increasingly blue state. Public lands was a significant part of our platforms, and those campaigns had to end for various reasons that maybe we'll talk about towards the end of this episode. But I guess the broader point of that is it is true and it is good that this is not everybody's top issue. It might be everybody's third issue,
Mhm.
but it's not everybody's first one. And in part because it's not everybody's top issue, there's a lot of misunderstanding and even misinformation about that. So, because Wes has spent a lot of time working on that and trying to educate the public and trying to get people out of the kind of environmental freakout that is maybe something that happens in other issues, but it's particularly infuriating when it happens here. Wes, I was wondering if you can comment on that at some length. I mean, most recently, there's been the whole U.S. Forest Service dismantling situation, but there's a lot of others. So please go ahead and rant in all the ways you like.
I have so many rants. So let's talk about the roadless rule because I think that's like a good segue into this conversation or a good intro into this conversation. And so the roadless rule was something that was enacted by the Clinton administration, came into effect in feel free to fact check me here, but 2001. And what it basically said was within U.S. Forest Service lands, we're not going to log anything that doesn't currently have any roads. And it just got, or it's in the process of being repealed by the Trump administration. And it sounds, it's one of those things that sounds really sexy, right? Like roadless. That's a good name for something. It really communicates, the idea that like, hey, these areas are special and they haven't been developed. And that's really cool. But, it's also one of those issues that like nobody understands and it's kind of not a big deal. And so industrial logging on public lands in America peaked in like the early 1980s. And ever since then, it's just kind of like it doesn't really make a ton of economic sense to like heavily log public lands anymore. Like, yes, public lands logging still takes place. Logging isn't always bad. If it's old growth forest that's special and we're never going to get again, maybe don't cut that down. But, like the whole conservation issue, the definition of conservation is managed use. We're supposed to use this stuff. If we manage it correctly, we're using it into perpetuity to benefit all future generations of Americans. Great. If something wasn't logged by 2001, it's probably not going to be logged, in like general speaking. Yes, there'll be some small areas of like, special old growth that are still vulnerable. But, if like by the time like 1980s technology came around and like the industrial exploitation of logging was at its peak, if it wasn't logged then, it was because it was really steep, because it was seismically active and they couldn't get anything in there, or it was just inaccessible for whatever reason, or it wasn't worthwhile. It didn't cost out to go in there and pull out trees. And so most logging now takes place, in tree farms, and it's a relatively sustainable activity, honestly. We don't have mills to log public land stuff anymore. Like tree farm stuff is like straight and uniform, and like they know exactly like the density of the wood they're going to process. They can, very, cost efficiently build a mill around that. And then you throw like a nice public lands log in there and it's full of knots and it's curved and they don't know how hard it's going to be. And, the mill's not going to be able to process that as cost efficiently as a tree farm. And so back to the idea of like roadless, it was administration rulemaking. It was executive branch rulemaking. Nobody seems to understand this in America anymore, but Congress makes laws. The executive branch makes rules. And rules can just be overturned by any subsequent administration or even by, the branch within that administration. They're just rules. They're just like, us as a company saying, hey, we're only going to use pink paper from now on. And then realizing that's dumb next week and going back to regular paper. And so the Rose Rule is kind of just one of those things. It's not important. But it's a sexy name. And so with the Trump administration, everybody thinks they're evil, which they generally kind of are. But, we have to, as people that are not evil, can't fall into the trap of just, shouting that the sky is falling every single time they do something. Let's speak about it with fact. Let's, analyze it. Let's not get all upset until it's time to get upset. And let's approach these issues reasonably. And so the Trump administration announced they were going to repeal the roadless rule. And the entire public lands world, was like, sky is falling, sky is falling, sky is falling. And, like we as the public only have so much, space in our brains for public lands based outrage. And so everybody's upset about this, and there's actually bad stuff happening, but nobody knows about that. Everybody cares about this roadless rule thing, which is just not going to have a ton of impact. The real point of rescinding the roadless rule was because Lisa Murkowski up in Alaska, she's in the pocket of like some logging companies. And, she's not as moderate as she tries to brand herself. And she's just trying to like give away the Tongass, America's largest rainforest, to China. And they want our old growth forests from our largest rainforest shipped over to China, subsidized by taxpayers. And that's kind of fucked up. If we actually speak about that issue from a place of fact and say, hey, this is all about Lisa Murkowski being in the pocket of China and the pocket of logging companies, and she wants tax money to like subsidize like the Chinese building industry, and that's weird and kind of not American, then we can like actually advocate effectively about that. Let's go and talk to her voters. Let's go to like Sitka, let's go to Juneau and say, hey, Lisa Murkowski is taking your tax dollars to fuck your salmon populations. And let's see how they feel about that. But instead, we're just sky is falling, give us money down here in the public lands world in lower 48 and not actually speaking about the issue with any facts. And so it's not efficacious.
Would you say that the better way in particular, and maybe as a model for other things, is because I know you don't really look very favorably on people just calling their senators or sending in comment to the agencies.
Right.
Would you say that a better way to do this is to try to actually threaten the legislators who are directly involved in this stuff for their reelection prospects?
Expressly in this case, because it is like this was just Lisa Murkowski's pound of flesh for voting for the One Big Beautiful Bill Act last summer. And we can like this is not like me speculating. This is all documented. Like this is real. This is real. And like we have people like the CEO of Patagonia, writing op-eds in Time magazine about the roadless rule. And it's like, dude, like spend your time and money as Patagonia being like, again, more effective. Buy a billboard in downtown Sitka and downtown Juneau and all these communities in Southeast Alaska that rely on salmon, logging in the Tongass fills up the water where the salmon spawn and then kills our salmon populations. This is very directly connected. And say, hey, Lisa Murkowski is coming for your salmon using your taxpayer dollars to give your lumber away to China. And she doesn't care about your community. Yes, that would actually be effective. That would put pressure on Lisa and she would knock it the fuck off. But just like randomly calling Steve Daines, my senator, he doesn't care. I hate to break it to you, but if you have a Republican senator that don't care about you, that work for billionaires, that's the nature of the Republican Party in its current form. They're just going to ignore you. And so there's this ton of advocacy right now around like, just call your senator, call your senator. It's like every fucking day, call your senator. And it's like, dude, that's not a reality based approach to success.
How do you think this applies to the recent change in the U.S. Forest Service's
Yeah, yeah.
structure? Because I
Uh,
know
uh,
that has been, yeah.
yeah. So, like again, I am a Democrat. I grew up in Europe. I am progressive as fuck, even though I hold some nuanced views about things like the Second Amendment, and I'm a reality based conservation practitioner. All that kind of stuff, and I respect my conservative friends. The Trump administration, like they're just grifters and awful people, and they're trying to give away our resources to their billionaire donors, and all that's bad, right? But we have to approach this stuff from a place of fact. And so what happened was the Forest Service is being run by this like industry stooge named Tom Schultz. And one of the fun, you know, wrinkles in this whole Trump thing is that everybody is so incompetent, right? And it's like hilarious how incompetent they are, and we can't let them we can't like treat them more seriously than they should be because they're just like incompetent stooges, and we might as well laugh about it. And we have to acknowledge that when we cover their actions because they're so laughably incompetent. And so what Luke's getting at here is there was an announcement recently that Tom Schultz, the guy who's running the Forest Service, who has no experience in the Forest Service, doesn't know what he's doing, wants to do a reorg. And I, like inside government agency reorganization, they can't really fire people anymore because there was a law passed about that last fall. So they're kind of trying to like backdoor their way into like getting some bureaucrats out of their out of their hair. And the Forest Service is like right now is there's 9 regional offices or sort of the general organization of the Forest Service. And so there's an announcement they want to pivot that to 15 state offices, mostly out west here, where most of the big forests are, but obviously in southeast and northeast too. They want to reduce research stations from like 57 to 20, which isn't necessarily bad. Again, they want to build a brand new facility in Colorado to sort of be a central management hub for research, which Jared Polis is very excited about because it'll give them a lot of money in Colorado to do some forestry projects. The problem is like this was seized on by like a popular public lands newsletter that's not always super reality based, and they published a headline the night that it happened. Breaking: Forest Service is being dismantled by evil Trump bros, and it's just like it's not. And part of that's just like this general lack of understanding amongst the public of how public lands actually work. The purpose of the Forest Service is not like it's not a good or bad entity. Its job is to permit industrial activity on Forest Service lands and do that under the parameters set by laws like FLIPMA and multiple use and all that kind of stuff. But like the Trump administration, like, if they want to just log everything, they can't dismantle the Forest Service because the Forest Service has to permit that activity, right? And so like it's just the Forest Service is not being dismantled. There's like a small reorg taking place that's not a huge deal. And B, even if it was being dismantled, it would kind of be good for like putting a pause on anything happening during the Trump administration. Right. And so like getting all upset about this, it just wastes again the capacity that the public has to care about public lands. And again, like, as the boy who cried wolf taught us, crying wolf makes people not believe you in the future. And so if we all go out there and, like shit our pants about, a Forest Service reorg, that's not a big deal. Then the next time something actually bad happens, the public's going to be, wait a second, that world is full of shit. They're just trying to get money out of our pockets for their nonprofits. And it's just, I don't know, it's just bad messaging and it upsets me. It's also like, my spectrumy sense of like justice and truth around journalism, gets triggered by that and makes me rage. So yeah, it's neither here nor there. And then the backstory that, because there is nuance and like complication behind a lot of this stuff is Congress is being really stupid right now. In addition to being incompetent, I know. In addition to being incompetent, in addition to like completely ceding their role as like co-equal branch of government and all that important stuff, these guys are also morons. I think running for office, Luke can probably comment on this, but my sense of like what's the word for it? My brain's not working.
Justice, competence.
No,
Uh, um,
just thinking these guys are more competent than we are.
Oh,
Thinking
yeah.
these guys are smarter than we are. I hate to break it to you, but like that bubble has burst for me.
Oh,
These
yeah.
people are absolute morons.
Yeah.
And so again, my senator Steve Daines here in Montana, who is finally retiring, good riddance. He started using a novel use of the Congressional Review Act to pull public lands rulemaking. And so these agencies, whether the U.S. Forest Service or the Bureau of Land Management, they write these big management plans that are in place for 10 or 20 years. And they look at like a big swath of land, like say like Eastern Montana. And they're just like, this is our plan. Like we're going to pull coal out of there. And we're going to build a solar farm there. And we're going to build a conservation easement here. And ranching can take place here. And, then they could write permits based on that plan. So every permit that gets written for a grazing or a solar panel or an oil well, the parameters for that permit are written as part of these management plans, right? So these management plans have never been considered rules, agency rulemaking. They're just sort of a scientific document and a procedural document that have taken place inside the agency. And good old Stevie realized that he could avoid the filibuster in the Senate and then revoke a bunch of like Biden era resource management plans that were stopping coal mines because coal's a thing again. Who the fuck understands that? And
And it's
uh,
powering the data centers too, which is an even weirder kind of
great.
thing.
Yeah, I don't know. It's just none of this stuff makes sense or is good for anybody other than like billionaires that donate to Republicans, which I guess is the reason for this. So he used the CRA to disprove resource management plans. And the problem is that, again, these are laws. And so it's shifted all these agency management plans into a category of rule that must be approved by Congress. And the CRA is retroactive back to 1996 when it was passed. So it wasn't just like the management plans that they wanted to disprove of. It's all management plans back to 1996 now have to be approved by Congress, and none ever have been because they weren't rules before. And so, like, every permit on public land is now invalid. Every permit on BLM land, every permit on Forest Service land is completely invalid. Every oil well, every solar panel, every individual rancher grazing a cow, there's no legal basis for that anymore. And the only resolution for that, so also in the CRA, there's a rider saying that replacement plans put in place can't be substantially similar. And so they can't just go back and say like, hey, Farmer Johnson's, grazing permit is cool now. They have to go back and like restudy Farmer Johnson's fucking grazing permit, right? And this is in all public lands nationwide. So this is insane. And so even while, we have, Brooke Rollins, Rick Perry's old lawyer running the USDA and Tom Schultz, who's never had any experience in the Forest Service running the Forest Service. And, as of probably this afternoon, Steve Pierce, who believes that, women, are property owned by their husbands running the BLM, these guys suddenly have to re-permit every single operation on their land. And not only have to do that work, but they have to fight lawsuits over all of this in federal courts that are already backlogged for like several years. And so, sure, they can try to do a reorg at the Forest Service, but their paperwork burden just like jumped to like 25 years of work. And, nothing's going to get done. And that's bad for the economy. It's really fucking bad for the economy. A lot of people are going to lose their jobs. A lot of ranchers aren't going to be able to like graze their cows. It's going to be impossible to be like an entrepreneurial independent oil business in America after this. That stuff's bad. But the upside for people that care about conservation and stuff like that is nothing's getting built, guys. And no trees are getting cut down. No oil wells are going in because everything that's in there now is going to be legally questionable. And it's not just like the Center for Biological Diversity that's going to be suing here. If like Wes's Oil Co. is mad about Luke Oil Co.'s permits, and you've been selling below the market rate, and I'm mad about it. I'm going to sue you over your permits, and I can because your permits are legally invalid, and we're just going to like go to court and throw money at each other for 10 years and not be drilling any oil, and that's going to happen for every ski resort, because like every ski resort operates on U.S. Forest Service land, every oil well on public land, again, every grazing permit, which is really going to hurt independent ranching. It means that all ranching in America will probably be done by Monsanto in the future. This stuff's dark and bad for the economy, but it means that like, in terms of the harm that the Trump administration could do to public land, Like there's just a giant pause button on top of that right now, and that's good because like this administration that wants to do all this harm is kind of being through their own incompetency has completely prevented their ability to do any harm.
It's
It's
kind of weird. It
yeah,
kind of reminds me how the irony of the Iraq War, for example, being the war that was supposed to save the American world order, wound up
yeah,
destroying it.
yeah,
Suddenly you have an actively evil kind of lands plot going and destroying the opportunity that balance sheet Bergum wants for like total extraction to solve the national debt or whatever. But
yeah.
I guess at some level, this opens up an interesting nuance to us that I wanna pry just a little bit about how to figure out where those nuances are. The thing with like increasing the paperwork load of the National Forest of the U.S. Forest Service by 10,000% or whatever means that there's going to be a lot more paperwork. But now that there's also been a whole heck of a lot of Forest Service employees, not just the rangers who've been riffed,
Mhm.
and you can probably assume that more will be let go over the course of the next couple of years. Some of them may well resign because of the move from Salt Lake to Salt Lake City. It seems to me that that might keep new oil leases from being done competently or happening at all, as you're saying. But 2 years from now, 3 years from now, when there's like an I don't know an AOC administration or a Buttigieg administration or
Love
something
that.
that like might be crazy in some ways but isn't crazy in this way,
Yeah,
um, an administration that comes in and you have the public land system. There's hopes to do more conservation work. There's hopes to do better research work. And yet you have a forest service that hasn't been dismantled the way people are saying it, but the reorganization was done incompetently enough, and the sheer amount of work has just increased that, like, I don't know, you could have had in Shoshone National Forest some local research center that was doing a lot of deep work there with the local universities. Now that that's been moved to Denver, the kind of process of trying to regain that local expertise and rebuild those institutional relationships just seems like it would be more difficult. I know Bram over at Our Public Lands and Waters has been talking a lot about Cascade Siskiyou National Monument, although I guess that's a BLM one, not U.S. Forest Service.
that's
But I
real. I
think
mean,
the point continues to still hold is if you want to do I don't know, post dam restoration work or something like that, and you no longer have an agency that can actually permit that kind of stuff. In not just in the short term, but in the conservation spirit in the long term, this I don't know, maybe not a disaster, but it does seem like stagnation. So I'm curious about your thoughts on that, number one, but I'm also curious how like at the level, not even as journalists, but as individuals who care about this stuff, how you
yeah,
can find the how you can actually like sift through the chaff and get to the nuanced stuff about why the dismantling doesn't matter in the short term, but also figure out like to what degree the freak out people have any kind of point at all. Like, how do you think about that?
yeah. That's a great question. You were asking about some of the long term impacts of this and how we repair after the Trump administration,
So,
and I
so
think
that's one thing, and then also like, how do you find the nuance in that as just
yes,
somebody who's reading about this stuff? Yeah.
yes. So I want to back up for 1 second and talk a little bit more about the Forest Service reorg, just because it's really important to be factual about this, because there was so much disinformation and so much fear mongering about it, and like again, that's just wrong. And so the Forest Service wants to relocate its headquarters to Salt Lake City, away from Washington D.C. There's always messaging around like being closer to the lands they manage, but like its headquarters staff, they're supposed to go talk to Congress. That's their entire job. They need to be close to Congress, right? We saw that with the BLM during Trump one, and it was just a disaster. They wanted to like relocate the BLM to like the Exxon break room in Grand Junction,
Grand,
Colorado.
yeah, Grand Junction, yeah, yeah, yeah.
And like only three staff ended up moving by the end of the administration because everybody drugged their heels, and just it just wasn't. Yeah, like it sucked. The BLM lost some talent, and like it was a problem. What they're doing this time is the Forest Service has like 270 total headquarters staff in Washington, and they only want to relocate 130 of them. And there's the Forest Service has 30,000 staff. Again, it's these regional offices which are trying to again make state offices, whatever, that where like the real work gets done. It's just not a huge deal. It'll probably get moved back during AOC's presidency in 3 years, fingers crossed. But yeah, so just trying to counteract some of that disinformation because there was so much about Forest Service. But to answer your question about how we like find the nuance, how we find the information, that's the role of journalists. The role of journalists isn't to write headlines that piss everybody off or get everybody upset. It's to help you guys understand these issues better. And journalism is changing right now. All the media organizations are going out of business. I lost my job, which is wild. So for readers that aren't aware, I was the most popular writer at Outside for a decade, and I was responsible for like in any given month, a quarter to a half of their total web traffic. And they fired me because like sort of an obeying advance thing because I wrote about politics for them because they asked me to write about politics. And there's not like a lot of like pleasant conclusions in writing about the Trump administration. I'm not going to sit there and blow smoke up the guy's ass or say the Supreme Court's awesome or something. And the guy who bought Outside is a jerk and fired me. And here I am out there looking for jobs, and it's like Washington Post just fired 300 journalists, BBC just fired 2,000, Forbes just laid off its entire staff, Associated Press just laid off half of its staff. So it's like there's like 5 journalism jobs. It's dark out there, and I write on Substack now, and it's great because I don't have to deal with like corporate oversight of my work. I literally had questions about Outside. I referred to, the far right bloc in the Supreme Court as like an inherently political project, and like they wouldn't let me like say that. It was like, I was writing an article about like potential attacks that might come later this year on the Antiquities Act, which gives us national monuments. And it was hard to make the point about the article without being able to like say the Supreme Court is like a political project right now. But so journalism is pivoting away from sort of like corporate media into independent media, and at the same time, all the social media platforms, your Google, your Facebook, all that stuff, they don't refer traffic anymore. And so if you go back like 5 years, you publish an article with a spicy headline, it gets on Google News, it gets on Apple News, it goes on Facebook, and you have 500,000 views, in a couple hours. That doesn't exist anymore. All those platforms keep their traffic internal right now. And so that same article would get like 5,000 views in today's environment. And so that's broken like the advertising model for all these big corporate media institutions. And that's why these layoffs are happening. But that means that our job as journalists is no longer to get clicks. Our job as journalists is going back to serving our readers. And honestly, despite the fact that I don't have a job right now and I'm not earning as much money as I did last year, it's like I'm excited for the future of journalism right now in a way that I haven't been for a while. And I'm really enjoying writing independently without corporate oversight. And so I can, with like your question about where public lands go, I can dive deep into that. I can really, really pursue individual stories there in a way that I couldn't have it Outside because they wouldn't have kept delivering the traffic that was my job to deliver. And the way that's changed is now on Substack because I serve my readers. I write about a niche topic, public lands policy or climate science or, feed my dog raw chicken. And yeah. And so I'm able to really dive deep into those topics and keep those going because my job is to inform my readers and to help them see through all that stuff with nuance, staying on these issues as they develop. And so that's really positive. Where I think this will go, and sort of the meta answer here to your question, is the way that we manage public lands in America is still based in like sort of an industrial past, where they're really, the whole role of BLM, the whole role of U.S. Forest Service, they're there to permit industrial activity for extraction projects. And I think especially as we, this summer's gonna be terrible for climate change, as we fall deeper into the climate disaster, as we transition away from, petrochemical based fuels, the role of public lands needs to be in, providing clean air, clean water, biodiversity, and giving people a chance to get outdoors, right? So I think that we need to, when we are as we're recovering as a nation from the Trump years, one of the things that we'll have to do, and that this use of the CRA to break all public land, permitting will force on us, is that we'll have to reconsider how we manage public lands. And we'll have to rewrite all of this. And hopefully we rewrite it around conservation and preservation and sort of like all that stuff, rather than, again, around logging and around oil, which is basically what public lands exist for right now.
I am really excited for that future that you're talking about too. I've been mulling it a little bit.
Yeah.
One of the reasons I've recently gotten into the space. One of the reasons why this podcast is even happening, is because there's a lot of folks, including some who I have worked with in other projects for many years, in conservative world in DC, young policy people who like are aides for people at think tanks and for
Hmm.
magazines, who are on what they consider to be the eco right, right?
Yeah.
And the eco right has this kind of framework that uh, you would hear a lot of people saying exactly what you said, right?
Hmm.
We need to get to a point where the greatness of America in the future involves having a more beautiful and a more sustainable and a more wonderful environment, and where we can get more of our people on our land to live the great American heritage of being adventurous and all that. And they will
Yes.
say all this stuff and hold their galas and all of this stuff. And then you look at the people in the galas, and you look at the people who are funding this kind of stuff, and they're all oil people, and they will
Yeah.
just like go right off to the back of it. There will be support for politicians who are not saving the boundary waters, not speaking up and saying anything about the thousands of rangers being laid out of the National Park Service, not saying
Yes.
anything about all this kind of things. And so I just looked around at that, and I guess I shouldn't have been befuddled by it for years the way that I have been. But the more I've noticed the greenwashing, the more I've noticed that there is no like intellectually sound and deeply politically serious conservative conservationist movement. There's a lot of things that are working to um, pretend to be it. I think there's some good people in some of them who are serious and frustrated in those, but they certainly aren't the ones who are managing things.
Yeah.
We come to another kind of disinformation project that I want to ask you about is the greenwashing. And so I'm just curious, like, for those who are not really able to tell the difference on this stuff, particularly for my friends in the right. What is greenwashing? How is it used? How do we tell what it is? How do we fight it?
Yeah. So to start there, I want to say, as a progressive person, I very much respect my friends in the conservative world. I grew up on a military base. My dad worked for the Department of Defense. He spread democracy using explosions. Obviously, it was flawlessly successful. I respect you guys and I understand where you come from. Um, and, as much as I'm prepared to acknowledge that there are problems on my side of the political table, I think you guys also have to acknowledge that, the right now is not an intellectually honest endeavor. And as we repair from the Trump years, we have to find our way back to debating topics honestly on their merits, and working together to find like a middle ground where we agree. Right. And that's honestly exciting. Like, yes, like Trump administration is going to be terrible. I hope I don't end up in alligator Auschwitz at some point for saying stuff like this, but like,
You would be close to the
we,
public lens, though.
yes, but yeah, exactly. But we get a chance to hopefully after this we get a really good chance to reinvent what America is, what our movement is, what our what being conservative means again. How do we find a new home for that in America post all this grifting? Um, and that's really exciting. And so back to the intellectual honesty thing, greenwashing, and it's something that both sides of the table use to try to convince people to vote for them. And it's just like, again, there's not a lot of good mainstream resources anymore. There's not a lot of good mainstream media, big, corporate media outlets that are saying this stuff. And so it gives a path for people to get, to get squeak by and squeak by on lying to you. And so we look at stuff like the Great American Outdoors Act is one of the big examples. And, like Steve Daines got credit for that somehow, and it's so weird because the Great American Outdoors Act was written by John Lewis, of Selma Bridge getting his head cracked fame, and what it tried to do was it tried to like make land and water conservation funds, permanently appropriated, and so LWCF was created in the late '60s, but it was had a target amount set in 1978 and $900 million a year. And so Great American Outdoors Act, to much fanfare, permanently appropriated $900 million through LWCF, which pulls royalties from offshore oil and gas extraction and applies it to public lands. And the purpose of it is supposed to be public lands acquisition, so we get new public lands. Um, Obviously, Republicans in their current form hate that, which is dumb. So they're trying to like use it for maintenance money and for like Doug Burgum, our wonderful Interior Secretary, has a plan to like give that money to states so they can like buy federal public land and then sell it because states can't really own public land in the way the federal government can constitutionally. Nobody understands that nuance. And so, what Great American Outdoors Act really did, despite all the fanfare of its claim of permanently appropriating $900 million, is inflation exists. And if $900 million was moved forward to today's money, it'd be like $2.7 billion a year. So we're like grossly underfunding less than half of like the original intention, right? I went back and averaged all the annual appropriations between 1978 and today. And, it was like the average, adjusted for inflation was like $800 million. So, we only increased the annual funding by $100 million. Nobody will tell you that because that won't get them reelected. And then the way that we're using that money to address the maintenance backlog on public lands. If you hadn't heard about this, our public lands are desperately underfunded, have been for decades. It's a typical Republican fail by design policy plan. And since the Great American Outdoors Act was passed in 2020,
2020.
yeah, it devoted a bunch of money to addressing the maintenance backlog. The maintenance backlog more than doubled between 2020 and 2025. And then last year, the Trump administration managed to add $12 billion to the total in national parks alone, just through like gross mismanagement and firing everybody and, keeping everything open and doing a government shutdown while leaving parks open. And they just, they're just fucking national parks. But Great American Outdoors Act exists to like tell you that they're providing money to these things, and they're just not. They're woefully underfunding them still. And nobody will tell you that. We have Democratic politicians here in Montana running for office based on Great American Outdoors Act today. And it's sad that like people believe in this stuff. And again, if we were able to actually have an intellectually honest conversation about this, we could say, well, Congress intended there to be $2.7 billion of funding. It's drawn as a royalty from offshore oil and gas, so it's neutral to taxpayers. Why aren't we funding this stuff? And why aren't we using this money as they intended, not for maintenance, but for acquisition? If we want to do maintenance, let's just appropriate a reasonable budget. The entire national budget for the National Park Service is like $3.6 billion a year. That's, like less than 2 days of the definitely not a war that we're fighting in Iran. We have the money in this nation to pay for stuff, and we just spend it on like, started giving up billionaires tax breaks instead of like actually like doing good. And I think one thing we can all agree on is that, national parks should have a reasonable budget so they aren't adding $12 billion to their national, their maintenance backlog in a year. Right.
I was talking to two of the staffers who were just commenting on the Patriot Parks Act, which I'm sure you've seen before.
Yeah.
And as you know, one of the logics of it was that the national parks are seriously underfunded, so this is one of the ways that you can fund them. And I was thinking about it, like xenophobically treating foreigners to like increase the individual park budgets by a pittance. When like there's much more money sitting around. And what they told me, and again, these like you hear stuff around the Hill all the time on this sort of thing, but one of the basics of it is that like there are always, so it's different when Democrats control Congress versus when Republicans control Congress. Although I think it is a failure that Democratic Congresses in the past 30 years haven't gone aggressively on this as well,
Agreed.
which makes this a bipartisan thing, even if it's weighted towards Republicans.
Yeah, we've squandered opportunities to address this, and it's just so disappointing. Yeah.
But the idea is that like for all of the like 100 progressive environmentalist groups, there's like maybe one or two progressive environmentalist groups making attempts to put stuff into the budgets, which means that like, of course, when you have a Republican Congress, there aren't the organized people trying to lobby to get this kind of stuff in, which I think is a damn shame, especially given that the priorities of a lot of the existing conservative environmentalist groups seem to be to work with the Trump administration and get the photo ops. And maybe that gets like one new thing designated, but it's at the expense of the vast majority of what else could be done. I would like to actually keep exploring this stuff, and I'm glad that you're working on it as much as you are in your reporting here too. So
thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a really interesting time once we all have to survive this and get through it. But like on the other side of this, we're going to have a lot of opportunities to address stuff, and I really hope that all this nuanced public lands conversation, which can get lost in the weeds so easily, becomes a part of the national conversation. And it's something that like is a platform that people campaign for president on. We need like Teddy Roosevelt 2.0 to be our next president, and we need like a Congress behind them that can see that this is a nonpartisan. I don't even want to call it bipartisan. This is a nonpartisan issue. This is like the fundamental backbone of America. Like, let's invest in our national parks. Let's invest in our public lands. And again, like these things are cheap. And they're great investments. Like every dollar invested in national parks results in $18 for the economy. It's like grossly, the scales are even wider, apart in U.S. Forest Service and BLM land. I think like every dollar invested in the BLM, again, grossly underfunded agency, results in like $200+ in economic outputs. This stuff is really, this is how we rebuild. This is how we, rebuild our economy afterwards, is making these investments. And the money is there. Everybody talks about how poor we are, but we're not. We're the richest country in history. Fucking make Elon Musk pay his fair share of taxes, and we could fund our public land system, forever into the future while like feeding children. Yeah, like come on.
Well, speaking of new Teddy Roosevelts and stuff, I would like to hear your experiences running for the Montana State Legislature back when
Yeah.
you did it. What made you want to run, and what did you like? How was your campaign? What did you run into? What should people who are trying to do that same thing know nowadays?
Yeah, so we have a citizen legislature in Montana, which on the surface sounds like the kind of way that like, government should be run in America. It meets for 90 days once every 2 years. It's supposed to be normal Montanans who take time out of their careers to show up and write the laws that govern all of us. Like that makes sense. But then you run into like the realities of it. And even outside the session, it's probably like a third of your total time has to be devoted to it. And there's not really meaningful compensation for the positions. So it's like $5,000 a year in compensation, which like all the travel, the apartment you have to rent in Helena to be close to the Capitol. I live 90 minutes from Helena here in Bozeman, so I'd have to go rent an apartment there. The session's obviously in like January, February, March, and April. So it's like can't be driving all the time. And I lost my job to it. Like the reason I was fired from outside was the guy who wanted to fire me used my campaign as the excuse to fire me because I put myself in written violation of my contract, even though they gave me verbal permission to do it. So it's like been struggling to find a new job in this media environment, and it's like I just couldn't continue to commit to something that was essentially like uncompensated volunteer work without having a mid six-figure career to support my ability to do volunteer work. So yeah, I was basically forced to drop out just through basically financial stuff. Not that we're poor, but like just I have to have a career, and I'm 45. I'm not at the point where I can retire yet. And keeping the Montana legislature in that form where you can't really participate in it unless you are retired, unless you are a business owner, unless you are independently wealthy. It kind of eliminates normal people like myself from participating, and I found that really frustrating. And you're gonna love this, but the other problem that I ran into was that the state of the Democratic Party in Montana is so bad right now. Like you called us a red state. We are not a red state. We are a purple state, which is something that I chose to live here because I want to live in a place that has Republicans and Democrats, right? And we are that. We have nuanced politics, people that understand, both sides here. We're just currently captured by the Republican Party because Democrats just choose to lose. And it's so frustrating. The whole Democratic Party right now is involved in this massive infight. At last year's sort of state convention, somebody insulted our former Senator John Tester, and he went home and took his toys with him. And so he's trying to like, he's attacking the Democratic Party. He's taking all of his money and access to donors away from regular politicians. The whole Democratic Party here is just a clusterfuck. And it wasn't like, it wasn't a place that was welcoming to me or something that was able to give me anything. And so I wanted to go and create change and create legislation to protect our public lands and to stand up for our marginalized populations. Like, our trans youth are under a ton of attack here. Our indigenous populations are under a ton of attack here. I wanted to go and help address those problems. And it just became increasingly apparent that I wasn't going to be able to because my party is in such a shambles that there was nobody to work with. There was no willingness to work with anybody. It's just a bunch of people looking for a capstone to their careers to say they were a state senator. And I couldn't work with that. And so here I was sacrificing loads of money to do this and just didn't see an upside to it. And so I just was like, God, fuck this, and dropped out. Um, and I'll go back to having a, great career and, writing work that matters and earning enough money that I can do meaningful volunteer work individually. And I think that'll be my way to give back in the future.
A somewhat similar experience, although I went into it kind of assuming that there was a 5% chance that I would win, and
Mhm.
that the bigger benefit of it was going to be getting a Republican nomination and making statements on things that most other Republicans, no other Republicans at a congressional level ever really would either have the freedom to say or the intention to say, right?
Yeah.
Like if you're fighting a losing race, then you can do whatever you want to do as long as you don't really have an intention of doing something further beyond that. So, and you might accidentally win and ask them to do
Right.
a recount just to double check.
And that's really honorable. It's great that you guys like you and I run for office. We need more normal people involved in politics, but we also have to find a way to make normal people able to participate in politics.
Yeah.
I was sort of so I was running for state legislature. It's a small market. I would have won my seat had I continued, but and that was the problem for me was like I was making a 4-year commitment to the people of my state, and I just didn't feel I could continue to ethically do that without having the ability to like earn money and actually get shit done. You know, if I was going to sacrifice income to go do it. So
And then
it,
you would have to be
yeah.
pressured to go into the machine and take all that stuff. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So it just wasn't. It just
yeah,
became apparent that it wasn't the right opportunity for me. So a fun little, side adventure in my career here over the last year, but whatever. It was. It
Well,
was. I learned. It was a learning opportunity.
yeah, and we're outdoorsmen, so adventures are what we do, and learning in some ways is what we do. So I would love
Exactly.
to chat with you more about that at some point, but it looks like we are running out of time to be on the air. So we will put that on tab for something in the future. But in the meantime, everybody listening, I cannot recommend Wes's Substack enough. It is a fun read whenever it comes out. Wes, would you like to give us all the links so we can follow your work further at and how we can just see the stuff that you say?
Yeah, so wessiler.substack.com. If you want to give me a paid subscription, again, this is, what I'm doing for work right now, so that would really help me. I'm taking a major hit right now, having lost my job. Make my wife very happy. I keep joking that I'm her trophy husband now, and she's like, ha ha ha, but really? And if you just want to see pictures of my hot wife and my cool dogs and my lifted trucks and all that kind of stuff, you can follow me on Instagram, just at Wes Siler.
And just as the last question, what gives you hope these days?
That's a great question. Again, just looking at, America has a 250-year history now. We have been through hard times before. We will recover from this, and the idea that Luke, you and I, and the readers and listeners of this podcast get to be involved in rebuilding America after this, it's going to be fucking awesome. And hopefully we just make it through and then get to like rewrite what America is and get to like, really like again, redefine our public lands, redefine how our agencies work and sit here and like, write a next 250-year chapter for America and continue to build this project.
Well, thanks for being on the show and having that hope, Wes.
Thanks
And
for having me.
of everybody listening, if any of you absolutely hate everything Wes just said, and you do any kind of conservation journalism at all, send me an email. I would love to talk about having you on the show so that we can get the diversity of viewpoints here that goes and makes that conversation we're talking about happen. And in the meantime, to Wes and to everybody listening here, may you all go match your mountains, and I will see you on the trail.